G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and I'm still well enough to make a few videos. If you are unaware, I'm going through chemotherapy. Today is number 2 of my 4th round, so I will get progressively worse, so I will miss a couple of days, and if I get a bit brain foggy, please bear with me. But legends, as always, we have a lot to go over and some breaking news as the US, they are halting military aid to Ukraine. We spoke about this in yesterday's video about so many are focused on the hard assets which may be able to be replaced by Europe. Tanks, artillery, things like that. But what cannot be replaced, if ever, the soft assets, the satellites, the ISR, the signals intelligence, human intelligence, all of that, which plays an even greater role, especially if we just look at Russia's missiles. So I think a byproduct is going to be that we will see a large increase in the effectiveness and efficiency of Russian missile and drone strikes just from early warning systems. But we'll go into depth in that. And also on that front, we need to look at what has now happened between the US and Ukraine and how that has deteriorated further. And we'll look at then US and Russia's relationship, and we'll talk about changes there as well and why this may be taking place. Of course, we're going to look at maps and geolocations and compare maps, and then a large portion of this video is going to be what I spoke on yesterday about have we or will we see a large strategic shift in Russia's war from a primary to a secondary goal of then division in NATO and those flipping, or was this always the case in a somewhat four-dimensional chess game? And we'll look at the art of war, we'll look at what Karl von Clausewitz says in then On War about that war and military actions drive politics. We'll talk with this about division in NATO and the warning that Rand gave back in 2019 specifically about this and pushing war to try and demilitarize Russia. So we'll talk, we've got a lot to go over, but let's go over firstly the US military aid and what is happening here. So we'll go chronological order on this. Now, this is actually the slide that I missed in the video yesterday and had to edit back in. But was Zelensky saying that the end of the war with Russia is very, very far away? And of course, President Trump, he has posted on his truth.com, this is the worst statement that could have been made by Zelensky. And America will not put up with it for much longer. It is what I am saying. This guy doesn't want there to be peace as long as he has America's backing. Europe, in the meeting they had with Zelensky, stated flatly that they cannot do the job without the US. Probably not a great statement to have been made in terms of a show of strength against Russia. What are they thinking? Now, one thing I will take out of this is he doesn't refer to Zelensky as President Zelensky and asking, what are they thinking? That if you can't do this without America, but you want to get into a position of power, well, how does this then work if the US is going, no, that we want peace? And this is something I see more and more and more as statements like this. And just from this gentleman on Twitter, Russia is on its knees, the economy is ruined, an army of donkeys, which is untrue, but Trump has just saved them from the brink of collapse. But along these lines is what we hear from all the way from the bottom to the top, to the leaders to the Redditors, is this idea that Russia can simultaneously be a threat to NATO, but also be collapsing and relying on donkeys at the front line. Remember, at one point, more than 2 years ago, relied on shovels instead of bombs, or a jar of pickles taking down a Su-34. But what I will say is Russia cannot simultaneously be a threat to NATO and be willing and able to invade European NATO countries while it has collapsed and is relying on donkeys. These are mutually exclusive. It is one or the other. Reporters, EU leaders, they need to pick at least one narrative in that, as it can't be both. And this is what we see, is realistically without US support, it is going to go downhill quickly. And I spoke about this yesterday with a full breakdown of different satellites, communications, all of that. And then an hour after that post by then Trump, Zelensky shared then this. We continue to work with our partners. We've already had talks and other steps to come soon. It is very important that we try to make our diplomacy really substantive to end this war the soonest possible. We need real peace, and Ukrainians want it most because the war ruins our cities and towns. We lose our people. We need to stop the war and to guarantee security. But all of this comes to the annex of being from a position of power. And of course, we know, well, how is that going to be reached? We're working together with American and our European partners and very much hope on US support on the path to peace. Peace is needed as soon as possible. And then this, if it could have deteriorated further, well then has, into this being reported by everyone today. Trump halts all US military aid to Ukraine. This was, of course, March 4th and 23 minutes ago when I was filming this. This was by Reuters that I'm looking at here, I believe, but everyone is reporting this. And what I say, too many people are focused on the hard assets. These can be bought from Rheinmetall or South Korea, somewhat, although that industry is a lot less than, say, General Dynamics in the States. But the biggest thing I see, look at yesterday, is the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, the signals intelligence, the electronic intelligence, the electronic counter warfare measures, all of that the US then leaves. This is huge. This can be catastrophic, especially when it comes to Russian missiles and the early warning on these. Now, what this also does with these US systems then leaving, or not being on, or not being used, or providing information, it then increases Putin's saber-rattling rhetoric about nuclear weapons, as the warning on those will be less if this then goes, look, they're not going to be fired, but it means that that has just increased in its danger if something like that did. So I think what we may see over the next coming days are potentially large Russian missile attacks that may have a lot larger consequences. Now, will we know about that because of the reporting for the last 3 years has just been out the fucking window? No, we won't. But I think if we go A equals B plus C, well, pretty obvious that that may be it. But also, do not underestimate the frontline morale. If you're at the front operating an American vehicle, the aid is gone, operating American systems, do not underestimate that, especially, I don't know yet if this includes Starlink, but I think that it may. So communications will be cut on the front line. Drones will be basically cut. So big deal. This is catastrophic if this goes ahead. But of course, this is what we've been speaking about. This is the leverage that the US then has. President Donald Trump has paused all military aid to Ukraine following his clash with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky last week, and of course the spat then online as well. Now, a White House official said the president has been clear that he's focused on peace. We need our partners to be committed to that goal as well. We are pausing and reviewing our aid to ensure that it is contributing to a solution. So our aid is contributing to a realistic peace that can occur very quickly, not a prolonging of the war as per then Europe may like to see due to that demilitarization of Russia and being able to use Ukraine to do that without their own guys, which personally I think is sickening. Anyway, Trump suggested on Monday that a deal to open up Ukraine's minerals to US investment could still be agreed despite his frustration with Kyiv. I'd say it'd be a lot worse deal now, as European leaders floated proposals for a truce in Russia's war with its neighbour. No, they haven't. The proposals floated still need to look like they haven't lost. So it's going to be a very difficult diplomacy here. Now, this was being reported by Reuters too. White House seeks plan for possible Russian sanctions relief. Now, the way I see this and the way that I believe Trump and the US see this is the fear of China's growth. That they see this as a way to peel Russia from becoming an extension of China in a similar way which NATO is an extension of US power, an extension of US power into Europe and into Eurasia, Asia, that for Europe, NATO is defensive. For America, NATO is expeditionary. Without that, of course, the US risks becoming an isolated, self-sufficient island. They'll still be of great power, but limited influence. China can be the same. That's why China will be looking, in my opinion, to then grow ties with Russia. And of course, you can see why Russia would want to grow ties with then China, just from industry, then export, import, all of this. So that is really a big step. And I don't see how Ukraine can realistically, or Europe can realistically say that this war can continue if that US aid is cut, because it will be, in my opinion, absolutely catastrophic. And again, I'll go back to the quote that I've shared very recently. When a commander orders his men into a battle, he knows they cannot win. He ceases to be a leader and becomes their executioner. Right, so I want to talk more about this study here. Now, what we've spoken about is that Russia's goal so far, at least on the surface, has been through either policy or attrition. And of course, that's not mutually exclusive. Of course, war can influence politics. That's what war is there to do. But either through policy attrition to deter NATO from having Ukraine join. Now, the Ukrainian goal in this war has been territorial. And we've spoken about how these approaches then don't complement Russia's war ambition. As Russia then, they are more happy to trade land for attrition rates because their war is based at policy where Ukraine's is at territory. So therefore, to have a positive attrition rate militarily, they will be more likely to trade ground. Now, what am I speaking about when I say that then war, it has a political aim? And we need to look back. We need to look back a long way, but still incredibly relevant and taught in all decent military colleges around the war, of course, of a Prussian officer, Karl von Clausewitz, with his famous book on war. And a few quotes in this as well, that war is politics by other means. And that on war, he argues, where war should be understood as an instrument of policy, not a separate entity. And the quote that I wanted to pull out was, the political object is the goal. War is the means of reaching it, and the means can never be considered in isolation from their purpose. So the goal for Russia, initially at least, was we don't want Ukraine in NATO. So we have to use war as a means to influence that policy or attrit to the degree where it will not occur. Now, what I'm going to argue in this is, we have seen that primary goal then shift into then a secondary, and now the primary goal being, what can we do to try and divide NATO further? And I want to speak on some problems in this. So we're going to break down this quote here, and this is using Google's AI. A political object is the goal, to achieve a specific political outcome, not just to fight for the sake of fighting. And this is where Western European leaders and reporters sort of fall over. This is what they want you to think. They want you to think along the lines of, these are just war-obsessed savages, they just want blood. Not for, no, there is a political outcome which they want in this, and war is the way to this. Now, whether you think that that is just or not, well, that's a personal opinion and bias, but it's not just this bloodthirsty thing that people would like, because it is simple. Now, this is what I said the other day, is there is this idea to try and oversimplify things so you discredit any other opinions that may not agree with that at its simplest form. War is the means of reaching it. Military action is considered a tool to attain the desired political objective. Means can never be considered in isolation from their purpose. One must always keep the overarching political goal in mind and not lose sight of the larger strategic context. Now, this is something I want to talk about before we move on to this. This is where authoritarian states or hybrid democracies, but we'll just say authoritarian, it's easier to sort of group into this, can benefit from undemocratic processes, as they can plan much further ahead, of course, than the typical 4-year voting cycles that we have. Additionally, these leaders, they remain in power for decades. They can refine their ability to shape their world order and hone their competence. What I will say in this is, regardless of your political bias, step out of that for a second. Who do you think has a more solid understanding of their nation's goals, as well as their nation's goals through political manoeuvring? Marco Rubio, who has been in power for a few weeks, or even, a leader somewhere else who has been in for 2, 3, 4 years, or someone like Sergei Lavrov, who has been in for 21 years. Now, again, remove your bias out of this. Who do you think has a more competent understanding of the world order, as it's going to be for decades' time they can go, as well as time in that position too. So I'm not saying, therefore, we all go authoritarian. What I'm pointing out is, in wartime, this is why martial law exists, is there are some pros and cons to different systems. This is the biggest fear of China, is China can plan 50 years, 100 years ahead, especially if you look at then China's history. Unlike us, where we are stuck at 2, 3, 4 year cycles. Realistically, that can be a large problem. But of course, it means we can move things faster and on a technological basis due to the freedom, independence, and democracy capitalist systems. But again, it's something we can touch on more. But what I'm getting at is, has the primary goal then shifted? And in this 2019 RAND report titled Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Terrain, so this one right in here, Extending Russia, RAND, the overall report, they examined strategies for the United States to put pressure on Russia. One of the key areas explored was Ukraine, where RAND analysed how US and NATO actions could strain Russia's military and economic resources. Now, the report, they also noted that deepening Western involvement in Ukraine could create divisions within NATO, as some European nations might be hesitant to provoke Russia too aggressively. Of course, we have seen this. The risk of internal disagreement within NATO was a concern, since some members prioritise economic ties with Russia over confrontation, which of course we have seen. So let's step into the past and look at what this was and look at maybe the plan of action and then speak about what has become and some of the problems in this. And I'll also give then the strategy here. So what I'm getting at is, has there been a strategic shift from just not having Ukraine in NATO to, right, we need to push in any way possible to try and divide NATO as much as we can by then the Russian command? This is then the RAND article. The United States could also become more vocal in its support for NATO membership for Ukraine. Some US policymakers, including Republican Senator 2016 presidential candidate Marco Rubio, backed this approach in the past, and Ukrainian President, then Poroshenko, promised to hold a referendum on the issue in the near future. While NATO's requirement for unanimity, so everyone has to vote, makes it unlikely that Ukraine could gain membership for the foreseeable future. Washington's pushing this possibility could boost Ukrainian resolve while leading Russia to redouble its efforts to forestall such a development. So what you're trying to do is, well, this isn't really on the table because there's going to be division here, but then we can make Russia redouble, and back to then the title of this, of extending Russia and competing from advantageous terrain. Let's continue as we get a bit more juicy. The risks in this. An increase in US security assistance to Ukraine would likely lead to a commensurate increase in both Russian aid to the separatists and the Russian military forces in Ukraine. Alternatively, Russia might counter-escalate, committing more troops and pushing them deeper into Ukraine, which of course we have seen. Russia might even preempt US action, escalating before any additional US aid arrives. Such escalation might extend Russia. Eastern Ukraine is already a drain. Taking more of Ukraine might only increase the burden, albeit at the expense of the Ukrainian people, which we have seen that a lot of these leaders do not care about. I don't care what they say, that at the expense of the Ukrainian people, they're to overextend Russia and create this drain on resources from military to the economy. However, such a move might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and to US prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace, which of course we are seeing right now. Some analysts maintain that Russia lacks the resources to escalate the conflict. War is expensive, and this leaves little room for another large-scale military maneuver by Russia. According to this view, Russia simply cannot afford to maintain a proxy war in Ukraine, although, given Russia's size and the importance it places on Ukraine, this might be an overly optimistic assumption. Yes, many analysts still believe this. They reported this back then. They reported it in 2022, in March and April, when Russia was out of missiles, and continuously have been incorrect on that analysis. Now, they touch on the risks of weapons being supplied to Ukraine, of course, ending up in the wrong hands. This was a study conducted for the President of Ukraine and for reasons of concern for the potential misuse of these weapons. They speak about that Russian propaganda, sort of overdoing the mishandling of these weapon systems, but that some of the systems here, as far as tracking this, are outdated and vulnerable. And we have seen tens of millions, if not a lot more, of this misused and sold, even back to that $40 million of mortar shells right in the peak of the war. And I think that person should be charged with murder, because if you have, taken $40 million worth of shells, that has therefore, you have then thought about doing that. So you've preemptively done that. And then that has had deaths on the front line. I think however many people would have died on that specific front line of the dump, you should be charged with 1,000 counts of murder. Also, the problem with some of these being captured and reverse engineered and in competition, this has actually happened not from captured, but this has happened with domestic weapons too. So I do know that Australian cardboard rubber band drone, that the problem was that was very effective in the beginning, but then that was just so easily copied internally in Ukraine that then it really affected then the company. US and other officials are concerned that Ukraine cannot be trusted with high-tech systems. The RAND team also concluded, however, on these problems, it's fixable and offered some recommendations. So they're saying it is somewhat fixable over time. So again, we have seen a bit of column A, a bit of column B, but they do say Ukraine is certainly more capable and reliable partner than those who the US has given lethal aid to before. Of course, then the Russian anti-Mujahideen, of course, in the Soviets' movement invasion into Afghanistan from 79 through to 89. So, but of course, not on the level of complexity or the level of lethality either. So let's continue on this because we get a little bit in the weeds there. But we talk about this of then the support that other countries would give for Ukraine joining NATO. But NATO operates by consensus, which means that any proposal to admit Ukraine into the alliance would need to garner unanimous support. So everyone. More vocal US advocacy of NATO membership for Ukraine would likely strengthen both Ukrainian morale and Russian determination to prevent such a deployment, thereby perhaps further extending Russia's commitment and costs. So again, you're trying to have Russia fight on disadvantageous terrain and then extend them out, putting NATO and America on advantageous terrain. So thereby perhaps further extending Russia's commitment and costs. Such a move would also engender opposition within NATO, detracting from what has otherwise been a rather unified front in opposition to Russian aggression. So of course, this does then go into the danger of division that we are currently seeing and seeing grow, I think, at an exponential rate. Likelihood of success. Eastern Ukraine is already a significant drain on Russian resources, exacerbated by the accompanying Western sanctions. Increasing US military aid would certainly drive up the Russian costs, but doing so could also increase the loss of Ukrainian lives and territory or result in a disadvantageous peace settlement. This would generally be seen as a serious setback for US policy. This, in my opinion, is exactly what we are seeing here, as well as the divisions being drawn in NATO. For my conclusion in this being, I think Russia's strategy will shift into how can we divide NATO the furthest, and I'll give how I think that Putin and his generals and other leaders may be seeing this conclusion. The option of expanding US military aid to Ukraine has to be evaluated principally on whether doing so could help end the conflict in the Donbass on acceptable terms, rather than simply on costs it imposes on Moscow. Of course, this is exactly not what has occurred. Boosting US aid as part of a broader diplomatic strategy to advance a settlement might well make sense, but calibrating the level of assistance to produce the desired effect while avoiding a damaging counter-escalation would be challenging. And of course, this went too far because then there was the invasion from this. And also, Measure 2 can go over this at some point if you want, but increasing support to the Syrian rebels against, of course, the Assad regime, which we saw happen then late last year. So pieces falling into place. Now let's get into this and where I'm calling the Willy strategy. And this is where I hinted at yesterday that we might see a shift in Russia's strategy as an opportunity has opened with the US administration. Previously, the goal was to deter NATO from allowing Ukraine's entry, but now Russian actions may focus on dividing NATO itself. This would be a far greater victory than simply preventing Ukraine from joining. So it is objectively true that a greater victory of division of NATO, that is far outweighs just Ukraine not joining. Now, whether this opportunity has simply presented itself due to that change in administration or is the result of calculated four-dimensional chess move from Russia, this, of course, can be debated, because many have said Willy is incorrect. This was always the strategy from the get-go, that Russia saw things like this RAND article. They had their own like this and thought, well, if we do this, those divisions, because we know this country and this country, they will want economic opportunity with Russia over then Ukraine in NATO, and eventually we will have that division. So again, is it a 4D chess move under the guise of this, or has it simply presented itself through opportunity now, the US administration wanting a peace and being, of course, hugely apart from where Europe want a continuation of bloodshed? To analyse this properly, You have to see it from Putin's perspective. If you want to be an analyst and you want to actually have reasonable analysis, you have to try and put yourself in then the opposing perspective or just different perspectives as well and see where may someone else see it. Because remember, they, on the other side of whatever, whether it is the West and the Taliban, they see it as strongly, if not more, than we do. Okay? Now, the majority of NATO members do not want direct discussions with Russia. So, Moscow will openly engage with the US, making the rest of NATO appear unwilling to negotiate. This exploits NATO's bureaucratic weaknesses and creates diplomatic stalemates, as NATO's consensus-based decision-making can be easily obstructed by member states with warmer ties to Russia. Of course, the NATO countries, as far as the US as the big player, but as Hungary and Slovakia for more energy there as well. Creates just a stalemate, further widening that division. Since NATO is actively opposing Russian energy, Moscow could strategically offer energy supplies to select NATO countries, for example, Hungary and Slovakia, at even below market prices to deepen internal divisions. And then as well with the bureaucracy, that the strategy is to just divide that. It doesn't matter if you're losing money on it, how can we just divide this further? Now, this is where I think the big risk comes in. I believe we may see a shift in Russia's approach, where it actively plays both sides against each other. The real danger here is that this opportunity isn't exclusive to Russia. It also extends to China. China does not care about NATO's expansion into Ukraine. I cannot see them caring about that. But if there is a real chance to weaken the world's strongest military alliance, Xi Jinping will be paying close attention, and I think his ears will be pricking up. That if there's a way to really then disintegrate, not even disintegrate, just to divide that, I think Xi will go, right, Putin, what do you need, or what actions can we take into place to further divide this? And you may not see it, but we are seeing these cracks and gaps grow more and more in NATO. And of course, who would this be a big win for? Well, the countries that are the think tanks and governments put as the axis of upheaval, well, then it would be in their benefit to do this however they see fit. So I think the strategy may not be anymore, how can we have this, localize this here? So how can we just divide that further? Because ultimately that will then lead to more successful outcomes. And as I stated yesterday, if this war ends in, then NATO, with a reduction in power and reduction of hegemony and ability to work within the alliance, that is a far bigger win. It's a far bigger win than anything on the battlefield. But again, things that are done on the battlefield are not done in a vacuum. They are done to influence or change policy and politics. Okay? War is not a single instrument. War is an orchestra with a conductor. Now, let's have a look at the maps and let's have a look at a few updates. Now, the map has just frozen. Give me 1 second. Here we go. We are back. So let's firstly go up into Kursk. And I wish that Kursk showed where the ground was and where it is now, as it is significantly different to then what it was yesterday. So we see this yesterday till today, significant change in this. And I've written it on here. So currently, that Ukraine hold 352 kilometre squares. Yesterday was 393. This is a change, a reduction in Russians' favour of 41.1 kilometre squares, or as my group likes to do, how much of Malta, of course being 13%. And Ukraine hold about a Malta here as well. But out of that, that is a significant change in one of Ukraine's, well, they say one of the, but Zelensky says one of like the trump cards on the table, which I fucking highly doubt. But either way, well, I highly doubt that, because even if it was a 10-to-1 swap, it is negligible for the overall, because the territorial ambition and policy ambition, as we stated in the beginning, is far different. But this is then shrinking very quickly. Now, those idiots, and I'll call them idiots, who believe that war is linear, who go, well, at this rate, that Russia still take 80 years to be in Kyiv, you don't understand the fucking fundamentals of then warfare, attrition, and protraction around linear is not the way to do things. You're interpreting data to fit your narrative, not interpreting realistic outcomes on the battlefield. if this was true, you could have also said when Ukraine entered Sudzha that in 3 days' time that they will be in Moscow. You can't do that. And the example I gave was, well, I can run 25 metres in 4 seconds. So therefore, I should be able to run a half an hour marathon. And the Ethiopians and the Kenyans better watch out. War is not linear. And we see this. It says start and stop and up and down. But attritional warfare, if it continues, it gets to a breaking point at some point. We call this the theory of bankruptcy. That bankruptcy comes little by little and then all at once. And at one point, whoever wins this war, if it is to extend in an attritional protracted conflict, if it is just to extend in that, at some point there will be a breaking factor and you'll see it do then the bankruptcy fall off a cliff at one point. Now, enough of me yelling at random people on the internet. Anyway, let's move down the maps. Now, there's no changes, I believe, around Toretsk shown on this map, but there are a lot of maps showing some, but not typically the maps that I use, but just we'll keep an eye on there. Take that on notice. We'll talk about that. Velika Novosilka, of course, out to the west, Belatsky, Privleni. We see further movement here. Of course, between here and Komar is really the big first line of defense. Now, what you can see in Komar, actually, I'll show you on this map, because if you zoom in on Komar, you can then see just to the left of the case, see this building? It's like a U shape. This is one of the administrative buildings. Now, of course, there's claims about what was here, but again, you can't know exactly what was here. In all these strikes with the Russian or Ukrainian, yeah, there was 1,000 people in the, but you don't fucking know. Regardless, this building, which would be a perfect location to set up areas like this, and probably hardened due to being built likely in Soviet times, would have a hardened basement, has been struck by a Fab 3000, at least a claimed Fab 3000. The claims around Fabs is like CNN around AR-15s. It's now everything is a Fab 3000. But we see this building right here as per I showed you on the geolocation. And you can see this direct strike, this hit of a Fab 3000. Now, people do not understand on explosions that it's not just the bang that kills you. It is also the shock wave and barotrauma, secondary fragmentation, all of this. It doesn't mean you're hit. If you're in any part of this, you're in a bad, bad way, if not killed. People underestimate how big a bomb like that actually is and how much internal overpressure you can have, and that this building has been completely destroyed. So we are seeing more Fabs re-entering the battlefield around this area, as well as west of here, around then the Otter front. So keep an eye on this around Stepnohursk, Stepove. I haven't shown them today, but I've always said keep an eye on those front line areas. Now, let's move our way up. And of course, we come to Pishani and this Zadazove area. So let's look in here. That Russian army begun new attack on Zadazove, taking control of the serious positions at the western forest and eastern outskirts. So a further movement down here. Again, yesterday in the afternoon, I believe, yes, we saw this. I can't remember if we showed this update or not, but now these are showing the same thing. So, okay, good to go. We can confirm that. Legends, a lot of changes. With this US cutting military aid, it's not the hard things that people are focused on. These people are always focused on what's hard, not what is soft. And, you can do a lot with what is soft. But focus on those, because Europe cannot replace that. And a lot of those European systems are solely reliant on that too. And from WhatsApp to Signal, Starlink, to just your drones on Starlink, that's huge. There's no other analog of that, to the ability to preemptively launch strikes, everything. And the division here, we will see. We will see. Legends, you have a fantastic day. And I'll speak to you hopefully tomorrow if I'm feeling well enough. And what I'll be keeping an eye on is I'm going to be keeping an eye on Rheinmetall's stock changes, as well as the US stock changes as well, to see how these decisions influence that as well. Then I'll actually be looking at Hanwha, which is a South Korean military company, the largest South Korean company from the ROK. So the reason I'm going to be looking at that is seeing where this influence changes, where Europe may then resupply. And of course, we know Europe is there at the butt stops really of their industrial capacity, but Hanwha, South Korea, through the constitution, they can't give aid to a country at war. So could we see, if that $300 billion gets unfrozen, stolen and taken to spend, could we then see that that money gets bought off South Korean arms? I'm just interested in looking at how the market actually responds to that. Anyway, have a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.